Okay, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Seabrook to talk about environmental influences on youth vaping.
Thank you, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be invited to give this talk today. The timing is extremely interesting because, as everyone knows, that Brescia is being integrated into Western effective May 1. And I had just heard yesterday in an email at nighttime that I'll be joining the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. I'm really excited about that. I'm going to admit someone here. There we go. So this talk is about environmental influences on youth vaping, but I'm going to give a little bit of context before I get into the environmental influences per se. So as we are aware, adolescence is a time that's marked by a lot of changes. That includes shifting norms, pressure to fit in, social and developmental changes. And what often happens is it's a period where the odds of substance use go up, and as well as risk-taking behavior. And in 2019, for example, 18% of Canadian youth between the ages of 15 and 19 consumed enough alcohol to put them at risk for chronic effects. And then in 2022, 30% of Canadian youth between the ages of 15 and 19, and almost half of young adults 20 to 24 reported trying vaping in their lifetime. Furthermore, 14% of those 15 to 19 years reported past month vaping, which is a better measure of how frequently they're using vapes. And 20%, of course, 1 of 5 of 24-year-old Canadians reported vaping in the past month. And then when we look at daily vape use, 6.5% of 15 to 19-year-olds vape every single day, or at least report that they do. And 10% of 20 to 24-year-olds report vaping every single day. And in case you're unaware, Canada has one of the highest teen vaping rates in the entire world. In 2023, just last year, I published a paper alongside Evan Wiley, who is actually on this call somewhere. Hi, Evan. Evan was actually a graduate right here, a master's degree in epidemiology biostats. And we did a study looking at nicotine and nicotine-free vaping among Canadian high school students. And it came from the 2019 Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey, a sample size of just a little bit over 38,000 high school students across the country. And what we found was in 2019, 26%, more than 1 of 4, had reported vaping in the past 30 days. And 12% had exclusively been using vapes that contain nicotine. It was far more common than nicotine-free vape use. And this probably won't surprise you, but we saw a strong correlation with various substances. So for instance, those who were current smokers were almost 5 times greater odds of vaping nicotine than those who were not smoking cigarettes. And then lifetime alcohol and cannabis use was associated with about 11 times odds of greater use of vaping nicotine specifically compared to non-users. The other interesting thing that came out of our study that I didn't give all the details here was every subsequent year of grade led to a much higher odds of nicotine use. So that doesn't mean that grade 9 students in high school were not using nicotine. They were, but they were far more likely with each subsequent year to go exclusively nicotine, which of course we know is really problematic because of the high risk of nicotine addiction. There we go. So how exactly is vaping harmful to youth? Well, there's many things that we know and many things that we don't know. We don't know a lot about the long-term impacts of vape use, but we do know that adolescent vaping is associated with nicotine addiction, exposure to harmful chemicals, The common question I get is, what is that compared to combustible cigarettes? There are less harmful chemicals in e-cigarettes, but not to downplay how bad it still is for youth. Seizures from nicotine toxicity, acute pulmonary injury, insufficient sleep, and also declines in exercise related endurance. So this is problematic because what we're seeing now are more people, for example, I'll just pick on a sport, playing hockey or soccer or football. And these are great athletes, but they're getting often hooked to vaping and they're running out of breath very easily. We also know that many nicotine vapes contain higher amounts of nicotine than combustible cigarettes, and that with the developing brain, so generally speaking, the brain is developed around age 25, but with a developing brain, people 15, 16, 17, this nicotine addiction can have an impact on brain development. Another major risk is that adolescent e cigarette users are more likely to initiate tobacco smoking. And, the meta-analyses show about a 5 times greater odds of going from using vapes only to actually initiating cigarette smoking. So this is obviously a major problem. And the like I said before, the long-term effects of vaping, although right now remains unknown, we're learning more and more, and this is concerning. It's also important to point out that vape use is not a homogenous activity. So often when you read about vaping in the literature, it's treated as literally a unitary behavior, like all vape use is the same. But the reality is that some people will use vapes exclusively with nicotine. Some may use nicotine-free products, and some may use their vapes for cannabis. So right now, what we know from the literature is that in terms of Canadian adolescents, the most common use of vapes is through nicotine, but about 1/3 of adolescents are using their vape products for cannabis. And this is concerning because those who vape THC with high potency have higher risk for things like psychosis, paranoia, cannabis hyperemesis, which is basically repeated and severe bouts of vomiting. And if we look at the THC content, this is where things kind of get a little bit like murky, messy, is that sometimes we'll do a systematic review, for example, and we'll include from all different decades. But when you look at the potency of THC, it's actually increased by about 400% from 3% in the 1980s to 15% in 2023. And by the way, that's Health Canada. If you talk to a lot of youth, they're saying we're not using 15%, like it's closer to 30%. So this is just average from Health Canada. So the big question is, what is drawing youth towards vaping? Well, it's largely attributable to aggressive marketing and flavored vape products. Examples I gave here are candy flavor, fruit flavor, dessert. There's even like a margarita mix, like everything you can possibly imagine. You see here on the slide, there's vape pancakes, vape French toast, basically every flavor you can imagine. And among 15 to 19-year-olds, the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey revealed that the most common reasons that these youth were vaping were for enjoyment, just pure experimentation, and to alleviate stress. And the biggest concern, of course, is that vapes have continued to grow in popularity among non-smoking youth, right? So when we think of vapes, we often think that they were used primarily for adults to quit cigarette smoking. But what it's done, unfortunately, is it attracts youth, and who often have never smoked cigarettes before. But then statistically, we know we're about 5 times odds of turning to cigarette smoking once they start vaping on a very frequent basis. So what are the correlates of adolescent vape use? There's many, but some of the big ones that we know that males are more likely to vape than females. However, that's not to downplay the importance of how frequent vape use is among females. It's the gap is very small, but generally speaking, literature shows males are more likely to vape. And kind of like I was saying earlier, the older you are, call it age, subsequent grade, the older you are, the more likely you are to turn to vapes and nicotine vapes, and a high correlation with polysubstance use. Some of you might not be aware of some of the provincial regulations of vape products, but as of January 2024, 6 provinces and territories have banned most flavors of vape products. These include Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Quebec. And while these changes are largely celebrated by anti-smoking advocates, the big question will be, how will this impact adults who are vaping and trying to quit? So this is always the challenge, right? My research is very specific to youth vaping. And also, Ontario, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan only permit the sale of flavored vaping liquids in specialty vape shops. I often get questions like, what impact will that make? I think it'll help, but we know that youth can also get vapes other places, online, through friends, etc. I was interviewed not too long ago by the Chronicle Herald, and they were saying to me, the person interviewing me, that it's very common there that a lot of the vape shops are continuing to sell vapes products to those who are not of age, and they're getting caught regularly. It's been in the news a lot. So they can sometimes access vapes even in specialty vape retailer stores. One area that we know less about is the relationship between vape use in youth and accessibility to vape retailers. And this is what some of my research right now is looking at. So in a review of mostly studies from the US, no surprise probably here, what the review showed was that vape retailers tend to be in close proximity to elementary and high schools, as well as colleges and universities. So you can imagine walking home from school or taking the bus or biking or whatever you're doing, and you're seeing vape shops located all over the place. Canadian studies have focused almost exclusively on vape retailers, specialty vape retailers, largely because of a lack of data on all retailers that sell vape products. So interestingly, vapes are most commonly actually purchased from like convenience stores, gas stations, but a lot of that can't get captured, right, in some of the Canadian research. And very concerning is that there's no provincial or federal regulations that restrict the location of vape retailers or their proximity to schools. Now, flip that around, this is where research in this area becomes really important, to see the impact of proximity to schools, for example, and vape retailer access, and whether that actually translates into a higher vape use. So that's a little bit of the context of what we know right now about youth vaping. And one area, like I said, that we know less about is the impact of the environment on vape use. So with the Human Environments Analysis Lab that I'm part of, and also on this, she's not here today, but Kelly Anderson is part of the systematic review as well, and Dr. Jason Gilliland and a few others that are part of EPI. We did a systematic review specifically on environmental influences on e-cigarette use among young people. And the objective was to identify features of the neighborhood environment that are associated with current use, and current use is always defined in the literature as past 30 days, and ever use, simply meaning have they ever used e-cigarettes in their lifetime, among young people, with a focus specifically on retailers, advertisements, social characteristics. I'll define those in a few slides, and policies. And this is the first systematic review that we're aware of to examine this relationship. So for the systematic review, neighborhood environment was defined as any geographic area that young people may visit, most commonly around their their home location, or their schools, and the proximity density around other vape stores, whether that be, specialty vape stores or what have you. And also includes elements of the built and social environment and forces that shape that. So that might include, for example, retailers, advertisements such as billboards or newspapers, social characteristics around like neighborhood socioeconomic status, for example, and policies such as those that restrict the sale or the use of e-cigarettes. I will also say that Dr. Jason Gilliland and myself and some others recently looked at the relationship between where these vape retailers are in Ontario and where they're located in terms of neighborhood socioeconomic status. And similar to alcohol, we found, unfortunately, that while they're everywhere, they tend to be clustered in areas of greater economic disadvantage. So the outcomes that we were interested in were the use of e-cigarettes, either ever or current use, again, in the past 30 days. Trying to get on, I'm going to admit them. In terms of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, we looked at all quantitative study designs that were written in English, and specifically that were published after 2006, because the first e-cigarette was successfully imported from China to the US in that year. So that's why we use that cutoff. Studies must have assessed neighborhood, environment, and again, as an outcome, either ever use or current use. And we use the World Health Organization definition of young people, those aged 10 to 24. However, if some studies looked at other age categories outside of that, but had an analysis done where they reported separately for 10 to 24-year-olds, that was also included in the systematic review. And there was no exclusions made based on where they live, geographic region. So searches were conducted at the beginning of the year 2021 and repeated in May 2022 using 8 different databases. So very thorough search: PubMed, Scopus, Web of Science, Sociological Abstracts, Nursing and Allied Health, PsycInfo, Embase, and CINAHL. And we also registered the protocol with Prospero. And essentially, when we did that, we really narrowed this down. So we started off with just over 10,000 records using the 8 databases. Duplicates were removed, did our title and abstract screening, got down to 575 articles of full text. And for various reasons, you can see here with the 528, we ended up using 47 studies in our review. So findings were summarized based on the outcome. So some papers, for example, would have only current use, some might have ever use, some might have both. Neighborhood characteristic, again, retailers, advertisements, social characteristics, and policies. And epidemiology, biostats, interaction is like a statistical term, but they use that in geography to talk about things like exposure, accessibility, density, and availability. Density, it would be like how many there are overall in a certain area, whereas proximity would be how close are you to certain retailers, say from your home or from schools. So exposure was usually self-report to vape advertisements. Accessibility was the ease that a retailer could be reached either from home or school or potentially both. Density, again, was the number of retailers within a given distance. And availability was the presence of a retailer within various distances from, again, either the home or the school. We also did a quality assessment, and we used the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and National Institutes of Health Quality assessment tools. We had 2 reviewers independently use one of the tools that was appropriate for the given study design. And they were essentially rated as yes, no, can't determine, not reported, not applicable, and then into good, fair, or poor quality. In terms of the results of the 47 studies, 18 were rated as good, 29 as fair, and none were reported as poor among the two independent reviewers. And the next little kind of description basically is just telling you that current use tend to be studied more oftenly than ever use, which makes sense. We're more interested in current use than ever use. Some of the questions that I get is, what about daily use? We always want that. It's hard to get enough numbers to be able to do anything with that or have it reported. So 37 studies assessed current use of e-cigarettes and 22 looked at ever use. 6 assessed retailers and current use, 7. You can kind of get the idea all the way through. Of the 47 studies, interestingly, 41 of the 47 came from the US. Very little research from Canada, only 5. And this is where, in my opinion, with systematic reviews, meta-analyses, this is only systematic review, but sometimes we have to be careful, right? When we take in all these different geographic locations, because things might be different in one area, like just Canada, but we use all geographic areas. 2 were from the UK, 1 from Indonesia. And the reason why the numbers don't add up is 1 was cross-national. And the sample size ranged from about 750 to almost 900,000 people. The vast majority of the studies were cross-sectional, 16 were cohort. And essentially, of the 47 studies, 122 reported relevant findings, of which 73 assessed current use, 49 ever use. And for current use, just over half found a statistically significant association with, and I'm going to break that down based on whether it was associated with vape use, ever or current, in this case, current, and 55% found a statistically significant association for ever use. So let's kind of look at this in more detail, but be specific to current use. Okay, so when we looked at retailers and current use, 6 studies assessed the relationship between neighborhood, retail, environment interactions and current use, which accounted for 10 different findings. Now, interestingly, of the 10 findings, there was no relationship in 6 of 10, whereas 4 found that neighborhood retail interactions were associated with higher current e-cigarette use. And in the discussion, I'm going to get into more detail about what a lot of this meant. I'm just going to give you the general picture first. When we looked at advertisements and current use, there were 17 studies that looked at neighborhood environment and current e-cigarette use. And that included things like kiosks, grocery stores, convenience stores, and drug stores, school environments, and outdoor environments such as billboards. And here we found something, a more positive relationship. Of 27 different findings, 17 found that interactions with advertisements were associated with higher e-cigarette use, and 10 found no significant association. Here's an example, by the way, in the pictures. Hits the spot. Vaping is at least 95% safer than smoking. So you see a lot of variability in the advertisements as well. When we looked at social characteristics and current use, there were 5 studies that looked at neighborhood, basically socioeconomic status and current use. And that accounted for 7 different findings. 4 of the 7 found a significant association with higher current e-cigarette use. 2 found no association, and 1 found that actually neighborhood social characteristics were associated with lower current use. In terms of policies, 13 explored the relationship between policies and current e-cigarette use, which accounted for 27 findings. And 16 of the 27 found no association, which is interesting. 8 found an association with lower e-cigarette use, and 3 found policies associated with higher current e-cigarette use. Here's an example of what you might see, for example, over in the pictures. When we looked at ever e-cigarette use, that means any time in their lifetime, there were 7 studies exploring the relationship between retailers and ever use. And that accounted for 10 different findings. Of the 10, 6 found no significant association, whereas 4 found that neighborhood retail interactions were associated with higher vape use. When we turn to advertisements and ever use, there was 11 studies that looked at the relationship between neighborhood environment and ever use, and that accounted for 22 findings. And if you look at the pictures, you can see, again, quite extreme. Mom and dad, talk to me about vaping while I'm still young enough to listen. You know, the vapetalk.org is your examples of advertisements you might see. The types of neighborhood environments included, again, kiosks, grocery stores, convenience stores, drugstores, as well as billboards and outside environments. And 12 of the 22 found that interactions with advertisements were associated with higher ever e-cigarette use, whereas 10 found no significant association. Interestingly, when we turn to social characteristics and ever use, only 1 study explored the relationship between neighborhood social characteristics and ever e-cigarette use, accounting for 4. And interestingly, only 1 of the 4 used an objectively measured neighborhood socioeconomic disadvantage, and found that it was not associated with past e-cigarette use. So of the only 1 that was objective, that found no association. When we turn to policies and ever use, 5 studies explored the relationship, and that accounted for 13 findings. And of the 13, 5 found no significant associations. 5 found that policies were associated with lower use, and 3 found that policies were associated with higher ever use. Let's look at a little bit more, because I wasn't going to show every single study by itself, but let's look at kind of what this is all showing. When we looked at retailers in the neighborhood environment, about 40% of studies reported that interaction with cigarette retailers was associated with higher odds of e-cigarette use, but all of them were subject to self-report data, which, as we know, can introduce bias. Another layer of complexity is that some studies only examine specialty retailers. So in other words, not gas stations, convenience stores, when we know that a lot of the vapes are sold in those locations. Some studies were limited by the methods in which researchers obtained e-cigarette locations, such as only using online search engines, which of course may not capture all vape retailers. So I would say overall, when we looked at retailers and the neighborhood environment, the results are largely mixed. Different picture when we looked more at advertisements in the neighborhood environment. So here, about 60% of studies that reported the interaction with e-cigarette advertisements, it was associated with higher e-cigarette use. But only 1 of the studies used an objective measure of advertising exposure. All other studies were based on, this is what I'm seeing, what I'm reporting. And we know that previous research identified that retail advertising exposure is the most common marketing channel, closely followed by things like the internet or television or movie advertisements. When we looked at neighborhood social characteristics, urbanicity demonstrated mixed results, possibly because rural residents are subject to fewer restrictions for advertisements, purchasing, and use of e-cigarettes. But again, like I mentioned a few slides back, in one study, the only single objectively measured neighborhood socioeconomic disadvantage showed no relationship with e-cigarette use. And interesting, I'm just going to highlight one of the studies. In one Canadian study of 4 provinces, increasing density of sports and recreation facilities around schools had a protective effect of against using e-cigarettes in young people. The idea being that if you have a clustering, if you would, of density of sports and recreation facilities, people are more likely to, less likely to use e-cigarettes. In terms of policies in the neighborhood environment, overall policies were not significantly associated with current or ever e-cigarette use, but the heterogeneity of the policies made it really difficult to draw firm conclusions. So approximately almost 1/3 of the studies reported that policies influencing the availability of e-cigarettes, such as e-cigarette age restrictions, retail license taxation, were associated with a lower odds, but only 30%. And I should also say, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's talk in Australia to ban the recreational use of e-cigarettes. Very, very. It hasn't happened yet, but they're in the talk of completely banning recreational vapes altogether. So that's kind of what we know in terms of a systematic review on environmental influences on youth vaping. I do want to say there's a few limitations that make this challenging in terms of like a meta-analysis. The one is that there's no standard definition of neighborhood in the literature, which adds a huge layer of complexity when trying to work out the relationship in a clear manner. The other thing is that because of many different changing discourse on e-cigarettes and many terms used to use e-cigarettes, it's possible that in the studies that some people may have misunderstood questions about vape use and underreported or overreported their use. And almost all of the studies use self-report to infer their results, which we know is not perfect. Here's kind of how I would sum up in conclusion what we found in our systematic review. So first, the purpose was to examine factors in the neighborhood environment that could be predisposing young people to e-cigarette use. I would say that more research is needed to look at objective measures and not just rely on self-report. And again, the vast majority of the studies were cross-sectional, meaning that we need a lot more longitudinal research to evaluate the long-term impact of policies, interventions, and interactions with the neighborhood environment. So with that said, some of the research that I'm working on right now, either as PI or co-PI, is specific to Ontario or Canada. So we're doing research now because remember that was a systematic review with no geographic restrictions. So we don't know a whole lot about Canada. We only had 5 studies. So what we're trying to do is look at things like evaluating the geographic distribution of alcohol, cannabis, and vape retailers, and trying to see does that link with actual substance use if they're located close to their homes or close to schools. I'm also part in the third bullet of a new multidisciplinary team here at Western, where we're using something called Help Make Informed Decisions About E-Cigarettes, multidisciplinary research on youth vaping behaviors and lung health, where we're actually looking at the impact of lung health longitudinally. There's a lot about, you probably heard about popcorn lung, especially among those who use vapes, very frequently. So we're trying to get that information and hoping that we get these results positively from the grants. So this is some of the work we're doing locally, and thanks so much for listening. This research was supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Children's Health Research Institute. And I don't know whether to call it Twitter or X. I can't keep up, but my X Twitter is here, and there's my email, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Well, Dr. Seabrook, that was really an interesting talk. I was amused by your comment of the not having a common definition of neighborhood, because I dare say that with both sociologists and geographers on the research team, I'd be willing to bet there was some within team debate about that as well. But certainly I'll throw the floor open to questions, and I'll run around with, actually I'll ask people to come to the center to use the microphone so that people who are listening by Zoom can hear the question. So questions.
Thank you, Dr. Seabrook. I was just wondering if across your research, you've came across any information about the difference between secondhand smoking and secondhand vaping, and if there's anything better about secondhand vaping, or if it's equally as harmful.
That's a great question. I have not done much on secondhand vaping. And I haven't done research in this area either, but one new area that's coming out too, unrelated, is vape use during pregnancy and its impact. And the challenge, of course, with that is we have cigarette, alcohol, but that's a new area of research. But I have not done anything new on secondhand. There's very little literature in that area.
And other questions?
Yeah, it's a very nice talk, Jeremy. So I just wanted to contribute in the sense of the definition of the neighborhood. In statistics, I can say that we don't have any problem because you can look at the distance, for example, include the notion of distance and neighborhood, and also the boundaries. Yeah. So we can look at the geography and see which location is near to which one, and also the distance people travel, perhaps, and that can also maybe can give a very comprehensive view in terms of the neighborhood and quantitative way. But that is a comment. But the question I wanted to ask, whether did you also look at the study design? Because you mentioned there were cohort study, case control study, whether that may have an impact on the results you found there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you didn't hear it, we basically asked what impacted study design. Did that change anything where, say, a cohort study might have a higher in the hierarchy than just looking at it cross-sectionally? The results were consistent right across the board, regardless of whether it was cross-sectional or whether it was cohort. Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you for the interesting presentation. My question is, you said one of the main limitation is the use of self-reported use of vaping, and you said it could be measured objectively. So if you could explain more on that, I mean, some examples of how it could be measured objectively.
That's an amazing question. Well, I will say this from the systematic review, almost all research on vape use is self-report at this point, but we need to get, and that's kind of where we're going with our research, more objective measures of vape use, including the impact on lungs, for example. That's kind of where we're going with the research now, but it is very difficult to get objectively measured at this point. Almost everything is based on self-report and current use of 30 days or ever use. Thank you.
I've got a question over here.
Hi, Dr. Jamie. My name is Deepmala, and I'm a first-year PhD student. My question is that I have lots of friends who vape, and I'm trying them to quit, and I sometimes hide their vape. So what do you think I should do so that they can stop, I guess? Give me some pointers, I guess.
I'll have them stopped by tomorrow. Just kidding. You know, one of the big challenges I find is that I'll speak at this level, is that very few people just vape. And I feel like vaping cessation is good. I mean, that's CIHR is putting out, you know, grant applications where you can, you know, vaping cessation. But I feel that we almost have to target poly substance use in terms of interventions. Obviously, we need to prevent them from starting vaping altogether. But you're right, so many people are vaping, and I can't speak to your friends, but a large percent are also not just vaping. So it is very difficult to say at this point, you know, if they're vaping regularly, certainly daily or, you know, several times, how do you just get them to stop because of the nicotine addiction, right? You know, raising prices might help, but, you know, nicotine, of course, in vapes has gone down, you know, in terms of policy, but, you know, they can get more, you know, so I think the flavored vape use that will help because they're really addicted to the flavors. But you know, what would I tell you in terms of a silver bullet approach? It's tough. You know, just encouraging physical activity and being together. I think that's part of the step, but I don't have an easy answer to how to get them to quit. I went to the CIHR end of grant workshop, and they brought in youth, and I gave a talk there, and someone came up to me and said, I agree with everything you're saying. I just can't stop. And I really appreciated that honesty. He said, I've tried everything. I've gone 2 or 3 days, and then I just go back full. And I've tried everything. I can't stop. And it was not just an N of one. I talked to a couple people that said similar messages. And this is where I'm really concerned because of the nicotine addiction potentially and how it can lead to more. So I don't really have an easy answer how to get them just to quit. We're working on it.
Hi, thank you for your interesting presentation. My question is, like, all the variables included in this systematic review, we have seen like mixed result across this study. So like going forward from here, do we think like, is there any miss variable that we want to look related to environmental factors that this paper are missing? Do we have any think about that?
That's a great question. One of the reasons why I love doing research with the HEAL lab is they're experts in geography. So you know, when I started as a professor in foods and nutrition, you always hear, you know, you are what you eat. And Jason Gilliland said to me, yeah, but you are where you live. And I love that because we often just see things in the lens of where we're doing our research. So yeah, I'm gonna you know, defer to some of my colleagues at HEAL to go, are there other types of built social environmental factors that we could also include? The mixed results to me isn't discouraging. I mean, the vast majority were from the US. There's a lot of noise in terms of the way neighborhood was even defined. So I think we need to dig deeper and we need more research in Canada. So that's kind of where we're going with that.
Also, like in one of your results slide, I guess you mentioned like of the 47 studies, 100 something. I just got confused in that. Maybe I see wrong. So can we see that slide again?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
In your results, one of the section, I think you mentioned like of the 47 studies, but there were more number.
Yeah, that's because there was a cross-national study.
Thank you so much.
Good question.
Next question.
Hi, that was a great talk. I think growing up in Canada, you get a lot of like messaging about the harms of cigarette use and tobacco use. And I feel like there is a large disconnect between e-cigarettes and vaping and traditional cigarette use. And so a lot of youth nowadays would be like, oh, I'd never touch a cigarette, but they're vaping every day. And so I was just wondering, because of this disconnect, if there was any research on like harm perception and how that can vary geographically. And so
Amazing question. I think based on research, I'll answer it this way. More youth are becoming aware that it's not good for them. But I think you're right. They're comparing it to, say, combustible cigarettes. And here's what I would say. Although there's fewer toxic chemicals in e-cigarettes relative to combustible cigarettes, there's still high levels of nicotine. Sometimes there's more, but high levels of nicotine. And we know that nicotine can be as addictive as cocaine or even heroin. So it's a major problem because once they're getting addicted to the nicotine, they're having a hard time getting off it. And we need more longitudinal research looking at those health impacts so that they're more aware. So when the younger generation, when the younger groups of adolescents make a decision, at least they can make a decision with more clear evidence, if that kind of makes sense. But I mean, even the harm, acute harms are not good at all. And I'll just say one more thing. I teach martial arts and I teach youth, and several of them go, oh, Mr. Seabrook, you just walk into bathrooms and everything is sticky, like everybody's vaping, and they know in schools they come in once in a while and do something about it, but it's almost impossible to stop right now. Major public health concern.
Question over here.
Thank you, Dr. Seabrook. So my interest towards your study is the data collection process, because I feel a lot of children, if they vape, they probably did not purchase, like e-cigarettes or anything from the retail stores or, those legal stores. They probably purchase those things from hidden markets. So I'm wondering, like, if you have ever considered this kind of like difficulties to collect your data.
Hidden markets are hard to sometimes get at, but I will say, yeah, there's lots of information about getting it online or through peers, and lots of information that despite age restrictions, many are still able to get it. There was one study done that compared, this is scary, but I'll tell you anyway, USA, Canada, and UK. And they looked at those that were of legal age or not by a lot, but Canada was the worst of the three for allowing underage to purchase vape products of the three, which is concerning.
Hello, great presentation, by the way. My name is Dia, and I'm a first-year master's student in the Epi stream. So my question kind of goes back to a comment you made. You did say that vaping is more prevalent in grade schoolers, and it affects their brain development. So the comment you made was that a lot of people that vape, they came to you and say they just can't quit. So there are some substances, I forget which one, but they permanently alter brain neural pathways. Do you think vaping also has that same kind of capability?
I think that vape use, certainly very regular vape use, can impact brain development. I mean, obviously, the more frequently they vape, the higher the likelihood, right? We don't know enough about brain development at this point, but I think for sure, in terms of the developing brain, it can definitely influence in a negative way.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. I'm so excited to come here. The questions are amazing.
It's an active group, isn't it? Other questions? Sorry, there's one here, and is there one?
Hello. You mentioned that we need more longitudinal studies, but you also mentioned that in the included studies, there was inconsistency in the definitions. So how can we ensure in future studies that there is a consistent measurement tool, maybe a reporting tool, just to make sure that, the definition, every study is using the same definitions, and we are not overestimating or underestimating our results?
I think if I got the latter part, you're saying, how can we ensure consistent definitions?
Yeah.
I wish
in
I
the
knew.
future studies.
I know. And it's like that in other areas of research too. It's very frustrating because you're absolutely correct. With different definitions, it gets very difficult to make sense of it all. It's not just with neighborhood. There's with many different variables in research where it's difficult getting the one consistent definition in the literature in research. But that's something we need to do a better job at. And the reality is neighborhood public health is messy sometimes.
I think there was a question over on this side, and if not, Dr. Strange has a question. Although I dare say you have a voice that doesn't need a microphone, but
thank you very much,
okay.
Jamie. I think you mentioned about the impact of the social determinants of that.
Yeah, it seems like things are coming back that way. That's definitely a possibility. Right now, though, I think the literature on vape use and SES is very mixed. And sometimes it says that higher income families are more likely to get vapes, but other time, even though they're clustered in areas of disadvantage. But I think, yeah, it's very possible. You know, I mean, the big challenge, of course, is that even when I was at the CIHR and a grant workshop, they said, our goal is by year, I can't remember the exact year, but within the next 10 years, to get cigarette smoking down to this. And that's a great goal, but here comes the vape, right? So it's like, okay, this is good on one hand, but on the other hand, we have these youth that are just completely addicted to this stuff. And it's challenging.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm a first-year master's student in epidemiology. My question was, within the literature included in the systematic review, did you come across any data on the effect of social media campaigns and online marketing on adolescent vape use?
Social media?
Yeah, social media campaigns.
No, very, very little, to be honest.
Okay.
Good question. That is an important area, but there was very little in that area.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? And I don't have a way of monitoring online. It occurs to me in terms of what, Sarah, do you want to put your hand up if there's any questions online, and then I'll figure out how to get into them. I can see your icon online. And I'm not seeing a hand, so I'm assuming there aren't any online questions at the moment. Are there any other questions in the room?
Our students were very excited about Jamie joining our class, that's why.
Yeah. I think, yeah, it's been a tremendous volume of questions. And so thank you very much, Jamie, for the presentation. And thank you, everyone, for your active participation this afternoon. Once again, join me in thanking Dr. Seabrook for his presentation.